Okay, welcome everyone to tonight's edition of our play series. And tonight we are continuing with modern plays. Tonight is going to be a discussion on The Life of Galileo by Bertold Brecht. This is also a very interesting play. It touches on some of the subjects that I think we probably have not dealt with in some of the other plays, essentially on the relationship of science, scientific truth, and some of the social implications of that, of scientific discovery. So this is a really interesting play. It was written around 1938. So right at the time as Hitler was coming to power, that's the context of it. Brecht was still living in Germany at the time, I believe, but very soon afterwards, he was forced to immigrate, and he kind of went around Europe and finally arriving. I think he finally got a visa to the United States, just trying to escape the Nazis as they have been basically rolling over Europe at that time. So this is the background of the Bertolt Brecht's play, The Galileo. Very interesting subject matter. So there's not much to say really. Well, I guess I'll say a few words about the play and kind of what it centers on. It's really kind of a summary of the life of Galileo as it touches his scientific discoveries and how they are perceived and reacted to by the powers that be, which specifically are religious powers at that time. So Galileo starts out in Padua, which is a city in the Venetian Republic. He makes certain breakthroughs with the invention of the telescope, which actually was invented in Amsterdam, but Galileo took some of those early discoveries and he really amplified and improved upon them. So that I believe the original telescope, you would have a magnification of like maybe times 3 or 4, and he improved upon that initial design, and it was I think it was a 30x magnification, so that you could actually see a lot of the things on the moon. You could observe the moons of Jupiter, observe the moons of Venus. Sorry, not the moons of Venus, but the phases of Venus. And so yeah, it was a time of really breakthroughs in astronomy. But the upshot of all of that was that it really threatened to overturn the scientific consensus of the cosmology that was based primarily on Aristotelian and biblical interpretation. So it was kind of this melding of the two main sources of authority, right? One source of authority was Aristotle, and the other was the Bible, or a particular interpretation of the Bible, maybe. And in both of those views, the world consisted of this very neatly packaged system, which we encounter if you guys have gone through our Dante series. That's exactly what people believed the world to be as Dante describes it. So you have the earth in the center, you have the sphere, the air, and then you have this sort of lunar orbit, which separates the changeable world, the world of decay, from the kind of the unchangeable, the fixed, the immortal, unchangeable, eternal world where all the stars are. And the planets were, of course, considered to be stars. And each one had a particular influence on human destiny and human lives. And so you have this sort of very neat geocentric model of the world, which kind of fits in with some of the biblical allusions, such as, in the book of Joshua, where Joshua commands the sun to stand still and not the earth to stand still. Um, Pretty shaky if you ask me as far as basis for like astronomical truth, but it kind of fit with that view. And then you have some other allusions to the world being grounded and sort of stationary, and that fit in with kind of the Aristotelian model. And of course, then you have work of Ptolemy in Almagest, which was really an unbelievable work, which consisted of all sorts of uh, predictions around this geocentric model, and it improved upon it, adding what are called epicycles, which are ways to account for the movement of the planets from a geocentric point of view. Obviously, when you look at it from that standpoint, the geocentric standpoint, things don't appear as they should. Just by observing how the planets move, they don't move in exact orbit. So what's up with that? Well, you have to invent these additional epicycles, which are these micro orbits around which planets are moving to explain their motion, which is sometimes retrograde. In other words, planets don't always move in one direction. They appear to move one way and then to move another way, which is, by the way, why they're called planets. Planets, the word planet means wanderer, right? It's not like it moves in a very neat little orbit. Anyway, the point being is that these discoveries by Galileo and by others, Kepler made his discoveries before Galileo, actually. So Kepler was already promulgating this idea of heliocentric model, which competed with the geocentric model. And this was all threatening to the church and to society, which is interesting, right? You would think, well, this is just science. Like, what does it have to do with like, why is the church threatened by this? Except maybe to say that it was threatened by this idea that perhaps the Bible is not inerrant, right? That's understandable. When you question this sort of source of authority, which people are regarding as inerrant, and now somebody else comes along and says, "Wait a second, it's not all eternal. There are spots on the sun, right, which are moving, appearing and disappearing. How's that possible? That doesn't jive with this idea of the world being perfect and fixed and kind of in this eternal divine light. So what's going on there? So the work Galileo explores some of these movements, both in the scientific realm and how it's being received in the religious, in the secular realm. And I think it's very ingenious. Plus, it shows how kind of the role of a person in this context. He's pressured to recant. He does recant. He is then forced to live under house arrest, and the work pretty much ends with him kind of the only thing he can do is let his pupil Andrea smuggle one of his works, which is I think it's the what is it, Two New Sciences, a work describing his work in physics and mechanics. So this is kind of my synopsis of the play, with kind of some of the ideas that it delves into. What I'm curious is what you thought were some of the salient points, and what impression in general did you have after reading it? I'm just curious if you thought it was more about science, or did you think at all about science and its relation to society, scientific truth versus social consensus, if you will. So I am curious if anybody wants to comment on any of these points. Type an exclamation point in the chat, or raise your hand. David, hey, good to see you, Dave.
Hey, Phil. Yeah, I just had, I'm sorry about the background noise here. What thought was that since the Bible isn't explicit about anything regarding the physical configurations or how to calculate, and Copernicus had already brought to the church a new model, the heliocentric model. He already had that model, yep. Which was different from the church's understanding, but not opposed to doctrine. And he didn't have a problem with the church opposing him or threatening him. Galileo's big goof in real history, not in his play, was to oppose the church's authority and the way they would interpret scripture. If he had just stuck to reporting the science and saying this is the model, it wouldn't have been the same thing. But he was saying science knows more than you, church, so we don't listen to the church. That is an oppositional tag. Now, he did use, I don't know why a bigger point was made, the fact that the telescopes were used in Italy to report in the arrival of ships in advance and to make money on it. So it was a mercantile advantage. So it was a big plus. He actually fulfilled the requirements they were supposed to. And yes, it was for him actually the springboard to what he wanted to do, but he definitely made an industrial impact in what he was doing. So, you know, he could have had a good standing if he hadn't been such a sort of loudmouth. I don't know. It's sort of how do you bring the truth and who are you going to slap in the face as you present it? Or do you want to fit it in with the status quo? And sometimes scientists don't see a need to comprehend the social condition and not disrupt it because there are other things that rely on people going to church and joining the government authority and things like that, which he may not have taken into account. That's all. Just want to
Mm,
bring.
interesting, interesting. Thank you, Dave. So yeah, I thought about something along the same lines too. In the first part there, Galileo is seen as very cooperative with um, the officials at Padua, and he's helping them with their kind of business ventures in a sense, right? Because like David mentioned, the invention of the telescope did have a profound impact on, in terms of military advantage, in terms of navigation. So all of those things were a plus. And um, so Galileo is seen as kind of being, in a lot of ways, trying to fit in into that society. Part of it is because he needed money, so he went along with whatever was going to bring him some cash. But part of it is he wasn't being necessarily antagonistic, maybe necessarily antagonistic. Now, my understanding of the trial of Galileo is that the issue there was not per se his insistence on the heliocentric model as a hypothesis, as a possible hypothesis. That, as we all know, was already proposed by Copernicus, a few decades earlier, rather. The problem from my understanding of that trial is that Galileo insisted that it wasn't just a model, it was actually the way things were. And that was the sticky point, because it's one thing to say that, as scientists, we have this idea of how the world works. It's another thing to say, this is the ultimate reality. And the ultimate reality claim, I think, is what irked the Pope Urban, I forget which Urban it was, the fourth, I think, maybe, who was originally a patron of Galileo's. He was a sympathizer, and he knew science, and he was sympathetic to Galileo's work, but he didn't like that dogmatic. It's interesting. Scientists it turns out, can be as dogmatic as religious leaders in terms of their theories. And I do have a little anecdote for you from my personal experience, which I think is maybe you'll find interesting. So I actually studied molecular biology for my degree, my undergrad degree at Columbia. And one of the things that I learned as an undergrad student, which everybody learns in like one of the first lectures you get, is something called the molecular biological dogma, which I thought was a really weird name. I didn't think of it at the time, but the more I thought about it later, I thought, that's such a weird name. Why would you call something a dogma in the science realm? I mean, everything in science is about experimentation and so, but maybe it was tongue in cheek, So, and the dogma was as follows: DNA to RNA to protein. That's the dogma. That was because that was the huge discovery of how proteins were manufactured. right? So there were, before Watson and Crick, it wasn't clear how, there were all kinds of theories about like what actually, makes proteins, and there were all sorts of ideas about it. But what their huge discovery was that no, this is how it works. You have the DNA, which gets transcribed into these RNA, messenger RNA blocks, and then the messenger RNA is then transcribed uh, into proteins by the ribosomes. Well, so that's the dogma, right? Well, of course, as any dogma, it fell apart because when we made our discoveries about viruses, one of the things that we've learned about viruses is something called a retrovirus. And a retrovirus operates completely differently. It takes the RNA and it produces DNA, and then from that DNA, which it produces using RNA in it, it has a little piece of RNA in it, then that gets transcribed into another messenger RNA, and that produces protein. So the order is reversed. The dogma, which was considered, unalterable, sacred, if you will, static, forever, eternal, this eternal truth turned out to be not always the case. Very similar things always tend to happen in science. Anytime in science somebody says this is the ultimate truth, never changes, we've proved it, it always seems to come back and bite somebody. And here's another example for you. So for the longest time, it was thought that heredity is purely based on the genes. And of course, you had this very famous scientist, quasi-scientist in Soviet Union, Lysenko, who was opposing the genetics and were saying, no, 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 it's not about genes. It's about nature and sort of like the environment. And people made fun of him, rightly so, because he was wrong for the way he was saying it. But it turned out, and these are more recent experiments in the 2000s, that there is something in living organisms where an environment can put a certain pressure that actually starts changing the genes, and not only the genes, but also how they're activated, because genes are kind of just passive, it's like code, and it's not exactly linear to understand that which parts of that code are going to be implemented and run, if you will, in the body. So the environment does play a huge role. So this idea that it's only the genes that affects heredity and affects what happens, it turned out to be falsified. And it was also considered like a dogma. It was considered a closed and shut case way back from the times of, I guess, Mendel and Darwin. And the scientist that was originally a proponent of that, Lamarck, he was the one that was kind of not demonized, but he was relegated to the dustbin of history, so we thought. But now the ideas of Lamarck, are being somewhat revived with some modifications, of course. But anyway, all that to say, the dogma in science seems to be, the dogmas in science do exist, and they exert certain influence and authority. And a lot of times they're just as strong as the ideas in kind of the religious and secular centers of thought. Bob, did you want to add something? Yes, epigenetic expression. Thank you, David. That's exactly what I was talking about.
Yeah, your story reminds me of Newton's laws. He has three laws. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and there are two other ones. They call them laws as if they were absolutely true. But when you go to Einstein, it's the theory of relativity. They don't call it the law of relativity. They call it the theory. So isn't that strange? And I'm sure there are a lot of other examples. Some things are laws and others are theories, and you could call a theory a dogma.
Right. Well, I mean, honestly, the word theory and a lot of times carries more weight than a law, because a law is really describing a single phenomenon typically, but a theory takes into account hundreds of different laws. Like evolutionary theory, it's not about one particular thing. It kind of takes into account all sorts of different phenomena. So in some ways, I wouldn't say that theory is less solid, if you will, than a law. But yes, I take your point that it's not necessarily something in stone, and nothing in science should be ever considered in stone. That's the whole point of it. Science, in our modern understanding, is more about the process, not about the answers. It's the process of, um, producing, making predictions and then being able to falsify them. So any prediction could be falsified, and any theory could turn out to be wrong. So that's why we should always keep an open mind. I guess that's the other lesson that comes out of all of this. Mike, go ahead.
Oh, all of those things that we've been talking about are models of reality and may have nothing to do with reality, and the underlying reality may not be where we think it is. Lysenko, Lysenko caused a lot of by being a maverick, um, and having the ear of Stalin. He caused a lot of problems, including maybe even the Ukraine problem we have today.
Possibly.
And
I think he might have been Ukrainian himself, though, just FYI.
Pardon? Say again?
I think he might have been Ukrainian himself originally, ethnically.
Yeah, that's probably most Russians that I've ever met, and there are a lot of them running around NASA right now. They told me they were Russian, and I didn't. And I've known some of them for 15 years, and now they've become Ukrainians.
Now they're all Ukrainians.
Um,
Uh,
the protein example that you had, Lysenko caused some problems by being a maverick. And the thing that we know about the model we have now with RNA, mRNA, ribosomes, and so forth, it tells you how to make proteins, but it doesn't tell you how to make livers and eyes. And there's a discussion about microtubules that also need to be mapped to tell you how those proteins assemble themselves into real organs. And we haven't even finished the other thing. But I guess one more thing, because I realize this is we're off. I'm off on a tangent again. One more thing is Galileo. Some of those discussions were introduced to him by his daughter. And there's a lot of correspondence that has been recently surfaced that tells her situation. And she told him to be careful with this, among other things, because of what happened to Giordano Bruno a few years before that. And the entire heliocentric thing was first surfaced in some correspondence. Now, how did she get so smart when women were essentially property at that point in time? She was in a convent, and for her whole life, and devoted herself to becoming smart.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't know about how smart she was, but I didn't know that they had extensive correspondence with Galileo, and he loved her dearly, apparently. And so there are lots of letters that we have between the two of them.
There's a book called Galileo's Daughter that discusses some of that and extensively footnoted too.
Interesting. Also, again, I don't know if you know this, but Galileo had 3 daughters out of wedlock. And that's why Virginia, who is in the play, is having trouble getting married, is because she is not legitimate. And so her choices were, she was unmarriable at the time in real life. In the play, she is betrothed to Ludovico, but of course Ludovico then breaks it off because Galileo is seen as this wild canon who is like not recanting and propagating all these dangerous ideas. So he says, forget it, I'm not marrying you. So Virginia ends up being alone. But in real life, she just, yeah, like you said, Mike, she went to a convent, and she was a nun for all of her life. She couldn't marry. So that's another interesting kind of side story here. All right. Let's see. Right. So this is I thought one of the more interesting parts of this play was a conversation that Galileo has with one of the learned monks. And essentially the monk says, look, I have a family. It's a working family. And, you know, their life is very hard. It's difficult. They work all day long. It's like, you know, it's not easy for them. And the only thing that gives them hope and comfort is this idea that God sees them, takes care of them, supports them, and they have this sort of promise of heaven at the end. So you're going to take that away from them because you think that, you know, this one model is more better than another. And so this conversation to me is very crucial because it raises this point that keeps coming back up, and we've seen it in many different works of literature. I think it was the same idea in Don Carlos, and definitely the same idea in Dostoevsky Brothers Karamazov, where you have this Grand Inquisitor story. And the idea is basically that for the masses need their opium, right? They need their religion to basically survive and to live. And so scientific truth is not more valuable than this sort of framework of a worldview that gives you hope. What do you guys think of that? Is that something that you buy into, or is that something, or do you think Galileo bought into it? Did he see it that way? I don't know. Like to me, this is kind of the crucial point of this whole play. It's not really so much about scientific discovery. It's the role and the relationship between objective truth and some, you know, scientific discoveries and the impact it has on society. Whether or not scientists should announce the truth, regardless of social implications, what impact it's going to have. Are they just going to be like these pioneers, these brave souls that, you know, proclaim whatever it is they want to proclaim and just let the chips fall where they may? Or do they need to be more kind of socially responsible, if you will? I think we live in the age of social responsibility and all the rest of it. What do you think? Is that something that is actually valid? Does the monk have a point, or is he just like another propaganda outlet? Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I think I'm slow to learn this, but apparently customs are tremendously important. I mean, you can this is a terrible example, but you can think of let's say you have baseball teams, and one of the teams wears red hats, and you're the scientist, and you said, and you it's very important to wear a red hat because you're promoting that team, and a scientist can come along and say, well, that's ridiculous. It doesn't make any difference. Oh, what you in and out with the color of your hat. Well, the custom is in Galileo's time, the church is tremendously important. What goes on there, and why unravel that to point out some narrow truth that science may have that the common man does not use. I mean, what the average man doesn't use a telescope, so so there's plenty to argue about there.
So you tend to agree with the monk
I'm
to a degree
forced
at
to.
least. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's true. And let me put it this way also. Science, by its very nature, very rarely, if at all, gives you absolute truth about anything. What it does, it tells you something maybe that's wrong, something that is not true, but it doesn't really tell you positively what is true for the most part. In other words, experiments can discount certain ideas, but they can very rarely do they, inductive experiments can prove something. It really takes kind of this deductive reasoning to arrive at things that are like eternally true forever, right? Like maybe like Euclidean geometry is an example where we know that certain things in geometry are true forever, and that's it. We're done because we've proven that. We have proofs, rigorous proofs. But in science, in terms of like physical science, is sugar good for you? Well, it depends. Take it, take your pick. Go to the time machine and if you're in the 60s, maybe it's good. Maybe if you're in the 90s, maybe it's bad. Maybe if you're in the 2000s, maybe it's bad again. So my point being is that scientific theories and ideas about the world are not in stone. They do change, but they have impact as they are proposed, as they are expounded to the larger audiences. They do have an effect, tremendous effect on society. And so what do we do with that? Bob, go ahead.
I got another one that is modern, that's going on right now, and that is AI. There's a big controversy about how much do we want to prove. You can say that AI is you have a lot of scientists working on it, but the science is not. It's not proven that AI can't be evil. That it could someday. It's going to be smarter than all of us and take over the world. So what should we do? Do we go with science or do we go with our current culture? So there you go.
And by the way, just for the record, maybe take a quick vote. Do we live in a heliocentric world or geocentric world? Who thinks we live in a heliocentric world? Raise your hand or heliocentric. Katie says heliocentric. Okay.
I get the dominant thing is the universe is locally expanding at the speed of light. So our minor perturbations around the sun are negligible compared to what's happening to the fabric of the universe.
Mike, you're non-committal. Just either for or against, please.
Oh, that's binary thinking. I'm for that. I'm gonna. I want to keep my job, so I'll vote for Helios.
Okay. All right. So here, let me burst your bubble, perhaps a little bit. First of all, the planets, including the sun and the sun, do not rotate around the center of the sun. They rotate around the center of mass of the solar system, which happens to be not exactly in the center. So it's a little bit off to the side. That's number one. But the second point, of course, is Albert Einstein and the theory of relativity and his idea that you have frames of references, right? Each frame is as valid as any other frame. So from the point of view of the Earth, you can say that that's a frame of reference. It's a valid frame of reference. And if you're standing on the Earth, that's your stationary point. Everything else is rotating around you. So the Ptolemaic system is just as true as it was 2,000 years ago if you take that particular frame of reference. Now, I guess to be fair, you need to say that any other frame of reference might be just as valid. So if you're on the moon is stationary. If you're on Jupiter, and if you're on the sun, then the sun is stationary. Frames of reference, right? Relativity. So we don't actually, scientists don't actually talk about heliocentrism as the kind of the paradigm. They really think of it in terms of which frame of reference are you working with, and each one is valid. So that's a new thought, right? That didn't occur to Copernicus or Newton or Galileo.
Or Einstein.
Or Einstein, perhaps. Well, Einstein proposed
that. He set out some basics, but if we're going to travel through wormholes and and figure out where they're going to be when we try to come back, we need some more basic science.
Yes, we do.
Otherwise, we'll just disappear, and and all that money that we spent will appear to be wasted.
That's a good thought. All right. Ava posted in the chat. I want to address her question or her comment that about how much of Galileo the play is actually based in historical truth. I think, Ava, most of it is pretty close to the record that we have. There's some difference, like I mentioned, with the story of his daughter, where she did not really get betrothed to anyone. She went to a convent, but everything else, as far as we know, is pretty close. Obviously, the personal conversations and some of those ideas, that's where the artist takes some liberties, and we kind of assume that. But in terms of kind of the actual facts of the story, I think it's pretty close. Any other comments or thoughts on any of the subjects that we've mentioned? Katie, go ahead.
My only thought, and I'm not sure how deep the thought to go into the thought, but the context of it, if it was written in the late 1930s, I mean, Hitler had already burned books, so this kind of culture of suppression is very, you know, I love to do this too, like to look back into other periods and think of, to analogize to their struggles from our struggles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think of the book burning, but yes, absolutely. There was another center of authority rising that was antithetical to science and antithetical to really to human freedom. That's really, perhaps this is maybe, you know, if you take it kind of in a larger context, that's what this play is about. It's still about this idea of expressing your humanity and living out the truth that you are. And to Galileo, the truth of his being was what he saw, what he experimented with, and what he was able to prove. And that was his kind of expression of himself. You know, last week we talked about the doll's house, and there was an open question: what is the main heroine going to do? How is she going to express herself? She is leaving one world to go seek herself, some truth of herself. So Galileo offers a particular kind of self-expression that is hampered by the forces around him, and he is kind of literally imprisoned, but he's also kind of spiritually imprisoned by all of these oppressive forces around him. But he still pursues what he thinks is right, and he makes experiments, he writes them down, he publishes the two new sciences, which is contains most of his experimentation on mechanics, physics of material science. So he does definitely pursue all of that, even though he is being hemmed in. So I think there's some continuity in terms of this idea of human freedom and human self-expression in both of those works. Yes, he did hide. He did hide it. Yes, as Katie points out. Let's see. Any other thoughts on this play? Did you guys think it was a significant play, or how does it stack up in some of the other works that we've done? Is it too narrow in its scope, or what did you think? Is it a great play? Let's put it this way. It's definitely a famous play, but is it a great play? Does it kind of explore the human condition and give us some pointers, or is it too narrow in its scope? Perhaps that's too restrictive of a question, kind of yes or no. But I thought it was pretty good in terms of how it went from different directions, right? It looked at science from Galileo's standpoint. It looked at it from a business standpoint, right? You have all these people that are in power, and they're looking to they don't want to condemn scientists because they realize that science offers them a way to prosper and to have an edge. And then you have religious leaders, you have friends who are advising Galileo to go with the flow, so to speak, and not to be so antagonistic. And then you have Galileo's own kind of modus operandi, which is to go where the truth leads him, and even if it leads him to imprisonment. Famously, there's this anecdote that when he recanted, he, under his breath, he whispered, "And yet it revolves." And so you couldn't completely silence him in this regard. And I think it's great in that portrayal of how you can't really, like, you can do a lot of things. You can burn books, you can forbid reading of certain books or whatever, but you can't really stamp out free will. And I like this play because it's kind of an example of that. And especially in that context of 1930s Germany, that's a huge thing, right? Because again, dissent is going to be silenced, and Hitler's going to amass this sort of single voice of authority around him, and all of that is going away. You're not going to have dissenting ideas floating in Hitler's Reich. And that's probably why Hitler never succeeded, his scientists never succeeded in building an atomic bomb, most likely, is because you do need freedom of thought, freedom of experimentation, freedom of expression, and these totalitarian systems, they don't produce that so much. And you can argue that the Soviet experiment also was largely built on the Americans and some of the stuff that they stole from the American labs. So it wasn't purely, it wasn't just a product of that totalitarian state. So anyway, 1500. Okay. Bob, go ahead.
I can't say whether it was a great play, but I thought it had a great theme. I think I saw it a long time ago. Didn't they threaten? Didn't the church authorities show Galileo the thumbscrews? And Galileo thought to himself, well, I better go along with what the church says. So I would, to me, from the modern point of view, well, a scientist may be angry. Why didn't Galileo? He had the truth. Why wasn't he allowed to show this? And the answer is that you can think of it as might makes right. There's a tremendous power. The church had a tremendous power, and they exercised it, and they didn't care, and science is way secondary, is way below in value to their power. And I guess I don't know why the play came out in 1938, but maybe they anticipated the I don't know Brecht's history, but maybe he was not too fond of Hitler, and he saw that Hitler was exercising a power in a bad way, and so the play fit the situation of 38.
Well, I'm sure there was some overhang of what was happening in Germany at that time that influenced the play. No question about it. I mean, play was published in 1938. By that time, you already had a lot
war
of things happened.
War was going on, yeah.
Yeah, so there was
Wait a minute, yeah.
well, not the war, but you had
39.
things that were happening it was pretty clear like the direction that things were taking. So definitely by that point it was alarming, to say the least. Yes, and absolutely. I think Katie just mentioned that about the book burnings, and absolutely there were all sorts of unbelievable things happening with censorship, and all this They were banning all the Jewish literature, right? All the anybody who was Jewish was immediately demonized and expunged from libraries and so on. So yes, there was already a lot of that going on. Katie, do you want to comment on any of that?
Yeah, I just now that it's jogging my memory because I went to library. I have a master's in library science, and that's one of their biggest values is intellectual freedom. So they're always talking about ban, because there still are in the U.S. lots of banned. In some places they'll ban like this is too. Each area has kind of its own things they don't like, but.
Well, we should probably I'm going to be it's not out of place to talk about scientific censorship today, right? We don't have church or state church, let's say in the United States anyway, dictating the rules of the discourse, but we certainly have centers of authority and centers of influence in the Western world that do have a huge say in things like what gets published or doesn't get published, right? You only have a few, comparatively few magazines that are, world renowned, like Nature or something like that, it's incredibly difficult to get into and to be recognized, especially if your ideas are controversial. And there are lots of examples of that today. I guess the most obvious one is with this idea of the origin of COVID-19, which, it's a scientific inquiry. How did the virus originate? And regardless of which side of that question you fall on, what's really important is having that discussion in the open and giving people freedom and ability to go where the facts lead them. Unfortunately, as we see today, a lot of these types of questions are very fraught with political connotations, and so we have a situation that's very, very similar to what Galileo faced, right? It's not just about the truth. It's about how is this going to influence society? How is it going to influence people and the world? And imagine if, it turns out that, in fact, the Chinese are responsible for essentially causing a world pandemic. That is going to have would have some pretty damning repercussions, wouldn't you say, for China? So obviously there's a lot in the play here. So this is why I think this play is somewhat relevant to us, even though it's, they talk about the church as being the evil center of power and, causing all this repression and so on. But in reality, we still have very similar forces at play today. So curious if anybody has any thoughts on that.
This isn't not necessarily the purpose of this today's discussion, but maybe this is more interesting than analyzing the play. I think we know for sure that China did do this. However, we also don't know for sure. We also know that there's a strong innuendo that CDC funded China to do it and gave them all their proteins and samples and did some of the analysis on their supercomputers to make that happen. So what we don't know and what we may never know is what the intention was in that. Gain of function discussion is certainly has some validity, because if you're an open scientist, if something evolved to the point where it could wipe out humanity, and you'd like to know about it and try to develop the antidote for it before it came out there. Now, did they figure they had all this and they just needed a large-scale beta test to see where they were going, and we got to be part of that beta test.
Right,
So,
right.
and
Right. Yeah, the main point, the main takeaway is, not necessarily the answer. So this is really what I think kind of, I always come back to this, that the science is not about the answers, it's about the process and the ability and the freedom to conduct that process so that we get better approximations, if you will, to reality. Scientists are
I,
not so much about the answers.
yeah, I thought I heard you say that Nature and Science and Cell and all those all those journals are above reproach in this process. And
Oh,
I'm not,
absolutely not.
no,
Absolutely.
you didn't say that.
I did
Okay.
not say
They
that. No,
participated in this.
they're anything but, and there's so many examples of it now that science is not this kind of isolated human activity, right? Isolated from the faults and pitfalls of humanity. It's very much part of our social institutions, and to the degree that our institutions are fallible and failing, you will see failures in the process of scientific methodology and what gets approved and the review process and so much. I mean, I have so many examples. I mean, I could maybe mention one as an example of censorship. It's kind of a touchy subject, but we might as well go there because that's what that's what this play is on, right? It's about things that are touchy in one way or another. And this particular one, I don't remember the exact name of the study, but it was basically a study on the Civil War economics of the South, or the economics of slavery. And it caused a huge controversy. And here's why. The study concluded that slavery was, in fact, a viable economic activity in the South. Like it wasn't outmoded, it wasn't unprofitable, it wasn't anything. Now, of course, it didn't condone slavery as an institution, but it just said that from an economic standpoint, it was perfectly viable. However, the climate at the time in the academia was such that it was impossible to publish a paper that did not have a conclusion that somehow slavery was this, outmoded or illogical, irrational institution. And so the paper was pushed back and pushed back. And finally, eventually, it was published as a book. And of course, scientists reviewed it, and there was nothing wrong with the research. The research was spot on. It was correct. It was, if you're interested, email me, or I'll try to find the name. It was something. It had some really catchy title too. The study did. So, but it shows, or at least it underscores this idea that, first of all, science is a social institution. It's not just about facts, and it does involve human judgment. It involves all sorts of human oversight and biases and prejudices of the time. And therefore, it's very, we need to be very open-minded and navigate carefully with anything that gets published or doesn't get published, things that we do hear, things that we don't hear. You have to kind of, I mean, we're living in a society now with the internet and a lot of both misinformation, but also a lot of opportunities to get things that are, quote, not sanctioned, right? So we do have that going for us. So it does create opportunities and also creates opportunity for misinformation and so on. Yeah, I don't know much about the processing piece, Ava, but that's an interesting point, which is kind of the barrier to entry, right? You can control a lot of things with barrier to entry. I mean, elections is a perfect example of that. You just control, who is a possible candidate, because it takes more than $100 million or whatever to even be nominated, right? To be in the running. So yes, absolutely. Economics and finance are definitely levers that can be used by those in power, those in control, who want to control the narrative, to absolutely do that. And by the way, physics is not the only science that's controversial. Social sciences are much more controversial than physical sciences, right? So anything that has to do with history, anything that has to do with anthropology, those are like minefields, because they have such huge social implications. And so Galileo probably didn't even think about those when he was think he thought he was controversial, but boy, I think any social scientist today can definitely relate to Galileo when it comes to kind of being ostracized, or you're not going to be under house arrest, but you could be without a job very easily, and that's probably worse than a house arrest. You could be literally on the street, ostracized, and black label. So it's yeah, it's definitely something to take into account. All right. Any last thoughts on this play? Any final thoughts, final observations, questions, anything you want to add? Speak now or forever hold your peace. All right. We are doing yeah, absolutely. And Ava, feel free if you want to speak up and express your thoughts. I mean, as opposed to typing might be easier. You've made a lot of great points tonight in the chat. No pressure though. Okay. All right. So, all right. So if nobody else has any insights or observations, then I guess we'll conclude tonight's meetup. And next time we are doing Tennessee Williams, A Streetcar Named Desire. That's in 2 weeks. And we'll proceed with some of the more modern plays after that as well. Thank you everyone for coming. Another great discussion, and look forward to our meetups in the future. Thanks again. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.